I feel like I'm gleaning craft tips every time I talk to somebody about craft. And from the writing process point of view, I think in many cases, it's made me feel comfortable with the process I have.
Hello, and welcome to The Writer's Mindset with me, Christina Adams, and Millie, who decided to crash, and not Ellie this week as she's lost her voice. This week, we're talking to Matty Dalrymple all about podcasting for authors. Our interviewee this week is Matty Dalrymple. Matty is a thriller and suspense author who lives with her husband and their dogs in Chester County, Pennsylvania. She enjoys vacationing on Mount Desert Island in Maine and Sedona in Arizona, and these locations provide settings for her work. Matty is also a member of Sisters in Crime and the Brandywine Valley Writers Group. And she hosts the Indy Author podcast, and that's Indy with a Y. I was a guest on there recently talking about writing myths, so after you've given this a listen, do go check that out. I'll include a link in the notes as well. I spoke to Matty about the pros and cons of podcasting for authors, regardless of genre. If you find this episode valuable, you can support The Writer's Mindset on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes, bonus content, and the undying gratitude for supporting all the work that goes into creating these episodes to inspire and motivate you. To find out more, visit patreon.com/Writer's Mindset. This week, I have been doing a lot of editing, both on The Mummy's Curse and Hollywood Heartbreak. And I found it easy to edit Hollywood Destiny and The Ghost Call at the same time. But I'm not finding that's the case with these two. And I don't know why, but flitting between the two is just not working for me. And I think in future, it's not something I'm going to do, but I've got deadlines that I've got to stick to now. So I'm going to have to for now. But yeah, even though they're in the same genre, I guess because they're in similar states and require similar amounts of work, it's harder. But my goal is still to publish them both by the end of this year. And then I think I'm just going to go back to the morning writing routines and spacing out my writing and editing and managing my time more. But I feel like I'm in a better place to be managing my time at the moment. Like I still feel a little bit overwhelmed, but not as much as I did. And I hope that will continue, but I know that it probably won't because I do get overwhelmed sometimes and I do get distracted by shiny objects. And, it is an ongoing battle to stay productive, particularly when the main person you're accountable to is yourself. And there's nothing wrong with having those relapses or struggling sometimes. And I just want you to know that if you ever do feel overwhelmed or like you're struggling, you really aren't alone. Please do come join us in the Facebook group, which is writerscookbook.com/Facebook group. We've all been there. We all understand it. We all support each other. So please do reach out and don't be afraid to ask for help or just take some time to chill if you're feeling overwhelmed. There's no harm in it. So then let's go join Matty. Today, I am joined by Matty Dalrymple of the Indy Author podcast. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
So tell us a little bit about you and your podcast.
My first foray into the writing and publishing world was with fiction. So I write two series, the Ann Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts. And I have my latest Ann Kinnear suspense novel here, A Furnace for Your Foe. It starts out with a sense of death. And the other series I have is the Lizzie Ballard thrillers. Rock, Paper, Scissors, Snakes and Ladders, and The Iron Ring. And then, as I mentioned, I also have a number of Ann Kinnear suspense shorts. But in 2016, I think, I got into the podcasting world, and I also got into the nonfiction world as the Indy author, Indy with a Y, I-N-D-Y, and explore the writing craft and the publishing voyage, much as you have the cookbook metaphor. For that, I've followed the nautical metaphor. And so I have a podcast called The Indy Author and a couple of nonfiction books. And I also speak on writing and publishing.
Nice. I think the metaphors definitely help remind you that this is an ongoing journey, as you say, with the voyage thing, because some people often think when they've published that first book, it's the end, and it's really not. It's the beginning.
Yeah. There's no aspect of writing or publishing that I've encountered that doesn't have a great analogy in the nautical world. So I haven't tapped it out yet.
Yeah, for us, it's cars and cooking. Although my co-host doesn't actually drive. So I think a lot of my car analogies go over her head, but I'm going to do it. I'm surrounded by cars all the time. So I'm going to do it.
Well, I just had a podcast interview with Sasha Black, the Rebel author, and
Yep.
she had a great analogy for characters to the body. So that
Oh,
the
yeah. Yeah, I
hero
think
is
I've
the
heard of some of that one,
heart,
yeah.
and the side characters are like the veins and the arteries. It was really a very illuminating metaphor. So that can really help to have
Yeah.
something else outside writing and publishing to compare it to.
Yeah, it definitely helps you contextualize things, particularly if you're new to it and you're trying to get to grips with it as much as possible before you really dive in. So, why did you decide to start your podcast then?
When I first started it, it was really a combination. Well, I shouldn't say that. It still is this a combination of networking and learning. So I started it basically with guests from the writers group that I belonged to. And it was at the time I was still working my full-time day job. And I would just put out episodes when I met a person through the writers group that had an interesting area of expertise that I wanted to learn about or that I wanted to share with the other members, basically, of the writers group. So, someone who is very good at doing readings, someone else who was in the small publisher arena. So it was really networking and learning. And I would say those are still my primary drivers for the podcast. It's just, the scope has expanded a little bit, but that was what really interested me to begin with.
Yeah, I totally get that. I found it to be a really good networking tool. And I don't know why, but it never occurred to me when I started. I'm like, why didn't I do this sooner? I get to talk to people about writing.
Yeah, exactly. And, and then kindly share out that information with other people who can benefit from it.
Yeah, which is exactly why I started the Writer's Cookbook. Like, when was it? 7 years ago? 8 years ago? 2014, whenever that was. And then you almost forget that when you've been doing it for so long, I think. And it's nice to remind yourself and almost go back to the beginning. Or it was for me anyway.
Yeah. About relooking at your motives for it or your goals for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say then those are the biggest benefits of podcasting for writers? Would you say there are any more?
Well, I think that the two other obvious ones are I'm emphasizing the selfish motivations, which are networking and learning. There's the unselfish motivation of then sharing that information, both unselfish for the people who are getting it and unselfish for the person who's sharing the information. So, they can share it once and hopefully have it be shared across, dozens or hundreds or thousands of people through that one effort. And then, of course, the other selfish reason is making money, the whole monetization idea. And, maybe we'll get to that later, but I think those are the primary drivers. As I said, I have a book called The Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, and it is creating connections, the networking aspect, creating community, reaching out to the people you want to reach, and income.
What would you say then on the flip side is the hardest part about podcasting?
Well, I have found that the hardest part is balancing the time and effort with the benefit both to myself and to my listeners and followers. So early on, I started using Descript. Descript, or I guess they actually pronounce it Descript, is the tool I use to edit my audio and video for my podcast. And it also creates an automated transcript. And so I thought, oh, this is great. I'll put up the transcript. And I probably should have thought that through a little more thoroughly, because once I did it, like once you offer something, it's harder to pull it back because people get used to it. But I found I was probably spending, I don't know, like 8 hours on editing for every hour of podcast, finished hours of podcast time that I was putting out, which was really not a supportable schedule. And so over time, I've reduced that somewhat, both because I've gotten better at using Descript. And also, I'm trying to be better about balancing the putting out a really polished final product, which of course has its benefits, but kind of has its downsides too, because it not only takes me a lot of time, but I also think that at some point you polish it up so much, you lose something from what the guest is saying. So one of the things that's been hardest for me with a podcast is balancing that, producing a very polished end product with the time it's taking me, and then looking at what I think will benefit the listeners the most. So I was surprised when I found out that a lot of the people are reading the transcripts. They're not listening to the podcast, and that may be a function that, for the last year, people haven't been commuting to work as much as they used to. But once I found that, then I didn't want to pull back on providing a highly polished transcript, even if I was providing, a somewhat more naturalistic audio and video experience. So I'm still wrestling with that. And another thing that I've wrestled with a bit in terms of managing the time versus benefit to me and my followers ratio is managing like patronage options. And I'd be curious to get your take on this because, you go onto these platforms like Patreon and they encourage you to have many different levels of patronage rewards, depending on how much you're making from each of those levels. And I just found it was getting to be too much of a time sink to manage that. And in fact, just this week on the podcast, I actually overhauled my patronage options to say, listen, if you give me anything, you're going to get a heartfelt thank you on the podcast and you're going to get access to a private Facebook group. So just determine your contribution based on the value you're getting from the podcast and the amount you're willing to give. Not like, oh, if I give another $1, I'll get a t-shirt. What has your experience been on that? Because I'm still wrestling with this.
Yeah, we kind of are as well, because we only set up our Patreon in March or April when we launched season 2, and we're on season 3 now. And so we were definitely kind of toying with the benefits, and we are going to overhaul ours, actually. I keep getting to update them, but we're going to change them and kind of strip it back and simplify it, because maintaining like all of the bonus content and uploading the episodes early for people and really engaging that community, it is hard. And my boyfriend linked me to a podcast episode actually that was an interview with the creator of Patreon, and he actually talks about what works most effectively for people on there. And he did say most people, they're not really paying for the benefits, they're paying to support creators that they love.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
they don't want loads and loads of benefits, they just want to go, I love you, have some money, kind of the same as when they buy a book.
I'm very glad to hear that somebody from Patreon was saying that, because that's my feeling exactly. And I know that it's dangerous to generalize from your own attitude to other ones, but that's my position exactly. Like, I don't really want the t-shirt. I just want to say thank you to the people who are providing the content.
I can send you a link to that podcast if you want, and I'll drop it into the show notes for any listeners who want to check it out.
That would be fantastic. And the other reason that I like that approach of scaling back on the benefits a bit is that I always felt guilty. So for time, I would post an outtake or an excerpt, like at the end of an interview with a guest, I would say, is there anything else you want to talk about for a couple of minutes that will be a patron-only extra? And I would post that, on the patron-only page. But every time I did that, I felt bad that I wasn't just sharing that with everybody. And I thought, it's kind of uncomfortable to be holding back information for that. So yeah, I'll be very interested to listen to that Patreon.
It's funny you should say that, because like I say, I haven't listened to the episode yet. I've discussed it with my boyfriend, and he was saying one of the tips the creator of Patreon suggested is to only release half a podcast episode and give the full episode to patrons only. And I talked about this with my co-host. I'm like, that feels wrong.
Yeah, it does feel wrong.
Feels slimy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's just me.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that not doing that, I hope, will redound positively to those of us who aren't doing that, where people are saying, I appreciate that they're sharing all the information that they have.
Yeah, because it doesn't cost a lot to support a podcast on Patreon a lot of the time, but then it does help to keep the podcast going and show people that you are providing value. Because I know, what's the stat? Something like more than 70% of podcasts don't last more than 10 episodes.
Yeah.
Because people either lose momentum, or they get bored, or they don't grow as fast as they want to, or whatever their expectations and goals are. And when you look at those stats, it's pretty mad to think that our podcast is already in that top 10, 20, whatever percent, and we only started in January.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the statistic, I was never able to track this down definitively, but that 70% don't go past 7 episodes. So
yeah. It's insane.
And in my book, The Indy Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, I talk about that. Think through, sit down and write down topics you'd like to address. And if you can't come up with more than 7, you should probably just put it aside for a little while, because there's enough startup effort and time that you don't want to dive into it unless you're feeling kind of comfortable that it's going to be something you're going to like to do.
Yeah, I think that's why having guests can be useful, because then they do a lot of the content creation for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I certainly found it easier since we've been having guests on, because aside from coming up with the questions, everything else is on the guest and just having a conversation. Whereas before we would have pages and pages of bullet pointed notes. And sometimes I would dictate the notes to give my hands a break, and then it came out sounding too much like a transcript because I was dictating it.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to do a solo show or even a show with one other person. And I know that one of the podcasts that I used to listen to religiously was The Career Author with Jay Thorne and Zach Bohannon. And, within the last year or so, I guess they have shut down that one and moved on to Writers Inc. with JD Barker. But when they were doing their final episodes, they would say, we've talked about pretty much like, how many times can you talk about the importance of having a book cover? And I was like, yeah, because like, God bless you. You two can't be expected to do it. And I kind of put in a little plug for having them add guests because I love the dynamic of that podcast. But I think they had different goals that were driving their decision to close that down. But yeah, I can't even imagine not having guests.
No, it's yeah, I've definitely found it a lot easier and a lot quicker than I did a few months ago. And that, like I say, that was part of the decision because my co-host is doing a master's degree at the moment and she's in dissertation mode. So it gives her a break to focus on her dissertation because we're not spending all that time planning or even recording. We just kind of sandwich the interviews in with an intro and an ending. And then I do the recording during the day when she's at work. So it's a lot easier.
Well, that is definitely a pro of teaming up with someone, both because you have that sort of mutual responsibility, like having a buddy that you go to the gym with. It's a little harder to get up in the morning and say, I don't think I'm going to do it today. But also that everybody has those peaks and valleys of other things you have to take care of. And it's nice if you can pair up with someone that you can work with to accommodate that.
Yeah, and having her do the show notes again makes my life easier because I don't have to keep listening to my own voice repeatedly.
Yeah.
Do you ever find that like you just can't stand listening to your own voice anymore?
I think I got used to it. Like I hated listening to my voice at all to begin with, but after a while you do get used to it. And so that hasn't been as much of a challenge as I might have thought it was going to be when I went into it. And also the way I use the editing software Descript is, I think it's probably intrinsically different than if people are using actual, traditional audio or video editing because you just edit it creates a transcript for you. You edit the transcript. And as you edit the transcript, it's editing the audio and video as well as the text. And so it's not as if I have to usually listen to the same sentence over and over again. Like that gets really old really fast, but normally I can get around having to do that using Descript.
Yeah, we tried Descript for one of our episodes, and it's definitely something we would consider going back to, I think, especially given I can't currently edit on my MacBook because it can't handle it. But I refuse to buy a new one until they bring out the new laptops.
Yeah, one of the challenges I had both with using Descript and also for the podcast and also doing recordings I was trying to do a recording of my audiobook. I was trying to do an audiobook of one of my nonfiction books, and my old MacBook, it labored so much that the fan would immediately spin up and it became like unmanageable to record with the MacBook pouring along. So I got one of those like M1 models or whatever it is that's fanless.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing.
Very nice. Yeah, I'm holding out the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 chip, and I think it's going to be like one of the last devices that they bring out, and it's killing me because my keyboard's broken.
Oh no!
But I've got my boyfriend's old PC, so I do a lot of stuff on there instead. Don't like being a PC person, but I'll tolerate it.
I agree.
So when you started your podcast, and maybe even now, what kind of surprised you the most about podcasting?
Well, the idea that a lot of people were using transcripts. So, and also the idea that a lot of people were listening on YouTube. Honestly, I still don't know how this works, but I'm assured by the people who follow me on YouTube that they're not going to go to a podcast platform to listen to it, but they will listen to it on YouTube. So just that idea that you can't generalize your own behavior to the behavior of the people you want to reach. And I guess that the other thing that surprised me pleasantly was that I have been so excited by the caliber of guests I've been able to get on the podcast. And I think that if, and I've gotten turned down too. So it's not like it's a magic door to talk to anybody you want to, but if you treat it professionally and if you treat your guests' time and effort with respect, that really helps. I've gotten, for example, Robert Dugoni. I had Stephen James on the podcast because I had attended a webinar that I really enjoyed that he wrote, and I asked him on the podcast to talk about the topic of that webinar. And in the process of doing that, he mentioned a story about Robert Dugoni's daughter. And so one of the things I always do, and this is a tip I'll share as a best practice for people who are podcasting, is never pass up an opportunity to use something that the guest says is a networking opportunity, because I'm much more likely to hear back from Robert Dugoni if I send him a note saying, Robert, you would just be interested that your friend Stephen James shared a cute story about your daughter on the Indie Author Podcast. Here it is. It's at minute 7.10. By the way, would you like to come and talk about a topic that I knew that he was interested in talking about? And so if you pave the way, you can quickly ramp up the level of celebrity and expertise of the people that you're inviting on there. And the more you capitalize on those networking opportunities, and it's not just networking because that sounds selfish, but those opportunities to share good things with the people on the podcast. Every time someone is mentioned in a complimentary way on the podcast, I always make sure to send them a note. I've sent notes to people who have done TED Talks. Zach Bohannon, in the interview he did with me, talked about a TED Talk that was really meaningful to him. So I found the woman's address. I sent it to her and I said, just wanted to let you know that, your TED Talk got a mention and there's a link in the show notes to it. And she wrote back and she said, that's so great to hear that people are doing that. So you're doing a service for yourself and you're doing a service for your fellow creators when you spread the word about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's easy to forget that creators do value it when other people are talking about them. It's nice to go, oh, something I've said or done really matters and really resonated with someone enough for them to share it with more people.
Exactly. And also, I mean, this is another good opportunity. I've had the experience of doing interviews with people and only months later happening upon the episode that I was in. And I hadn't gone looking for it because I figured they would tell me when my episode was up. So, make sure you extend that courtesy to your guests as well. Make sure they know when their episode is up and make sure they have all the tools they need to share it easily on social media or have nice image to use. Make it nice for them, and that good karma will come back to you.
Yeah, when I've been a guest on a couple of podcasts, they've sent me images and even sometimes text to share with my network to make it as easy as possible. I remember when I was on the self-publishing show, they did a really cool graphic of a cake, because obviously my site's the Writer's Cookbook. And cake is one of my favorite foods, so I just loved it. I'm like, I don't like orange, but I'll take the fact that they've designed a cake just for me, or maybe it's a stock photo, I don't know. But it looked really cool and it was really eye-catching and it kind of made me feel really special. It's like, oh, I've made it.
Yeah, exactly. And how much work was it for them to do that? Very little in comparison to the goodwill that, they've now engendered with you for their podcast. All too often, I see people go to all the trouble of doing a podcast that involves other people. I think all podcasts involve other people one way or the other, the effort of getting the guest and lining them up and doing the interview and all that administrative stuff. And then they just kind of let it go. And I'm like, no, there's still so much good to be tapped from that.
Yeah, marketing is probably more than half the challenge. It's not just the creation, it's getting as many people as possible to see and hear what you've actually created. Yep. And when you've got that big back catalogue, why not keep promoting it and keep bringing new people to it?
Exactly.
Because I was talking to Tim Lewis about networking for authors actually a few weeks ago, and he was saying the amount of times we've got a really big backlist and we forget to share that backlist of books. Instead, we're focusing on the front list, but then actually the backlist is what makes the most money. So why aren't we, trying to balance out the content we're sharing?
Yeah, I've spent much of my indie career trying to figure out a way to encapsulate what I like about indie publishing. And I came up with the A, the P, the B, and the 3 C's. So the benefits, I think, of traditional publishing are access. Unless I spend a ridiculous amount of time on it, I'm probably not going to see my book on the shelves of Barnes & Noble. And I'm not spending the time on it because it's not worth it to me. And bragging rights, being able to say that I would be published by a Big 5, Big 4, Big 3, whatever they are now, publisher, is always going to, be more bragging rights than to say I'm published by William Kingsfield Publishers, which is my own imprint. But the C's of indie publishing, I think, are creativity, i.e., you don't have to be creative on anyone else's schedule. If I get bogged down in a novel, I can always switch my attention to a nonfiction book or a podcast episode or something like that. Control, I'm never going to have a book cover I hate. And care. So that's coming back to what you were saying about the backlist. Nobody's ever going to care about your backlist the way you do. And I'm still primarily promoting my first Ann Kinnear book, which came out in 2013. And it's the way to go, because if I can hook them on the book one, they're going to read through the rest of the series. So don't forget your backlist in books, and don't forget your backlist in podcasts either. And I do that also for podcast episodes. I'll do little extras saying, back in 2019, so-and-so and I talked about this, and here's a little snippet. Here's the link where you can see the whole episode. And once again, that person sees that I'm continuing to make use of their content because I always flag them on those posts.
Yeah, because I think in the script you can create those little podcast snippets, can't you?
Yeah.
Like little quotables, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I haven't tried that feature on it, and I probably should. Like, we don't have it at the minute, but it's definitely something I would like to do. I've heard of a couple more apps that you can do it on as well, so I might experiment with that, ready for interview season.
Yeah. And even if you're just posting a straight video clip, I think in some cases that's more engaging. I use that Descript audiogram function that I think is what you're talking about, where it shows the little sound wave as the words appear. And that's nice if people don't want to have video taken, but I want to have something moving on social media, because that's more engaging. But even just a audio or video clip on its own can be very effective.
Yeah. All you need is a little bit to whet people's appetite about what you're going to be covering.
Exactly.
So speaking of the topics, how do you come up with your podcast or interview topics?
Well, a lot of it, especially related to the publishing voyage, is whatever I'm struggling with at the moment. So I'm always struggling with newsletters. So every couple of months, there's going to be something about newsletters. A lot of it is what I'm curious about, or what I'm hearing my circle of authors be curious about, saying, I'm stuck in with this kind of cross-genre book. And I'm like, cross-genre, that sounds interesting. I'm going to look for somebody who can talk about that. Sometimes it's that I've encountered someone or taken a course or read an article and have been interested by it and contact the person that way. And then on the writing craft side, it's normally people whose work I admire and that I want to hear them talk about a topic that I think their work especially nicely represents. And many authors are also instructors. And so it's great when you can find that person whose work you love and you know that they're going to be good at talking about it because you've experienced an online course that they've done or listened to a talk they gave at a conference or something like that. So, I mean, I'm probably revealing my own biases and needs based on the topics, but it's pretty wide ranging. There aren't many topics I think that we haven't covered in the coming up on 90 episodes of the podcast.
Nice. I mean, if you're looking to learn, it's the perfect way to do it, isn't it? And then you do help people who are having the exact same problem, because you never know how many people are having that issue as well.
Right, exactly. How about you? How do you guys pick your topics for the podcast?
It started off and we just brain dumped into a list. What do we want to know more about? What can people benefit from? What things have we seen people do that they shouldn't be doing? And it is actually things like our indie author mistakes and newbie writer mistakes that do really well, because people have got that, oh my God, I hope I'm not doing it kind of reaction to it. So those episodes are quite popular. And also we did a lot on character writing because I have a book on character writing. So we were kind of using the books that we've already published as inspiration for content. Like we did a couple when I released The Ghost Call at the end of June on like pen names, because I've got a second pen name for my fantasy writing, and on different genres and things. So some of it is inspired by what we see people talking about in our community, and also it's influenced by our writing and what we wanted to know or needed to know. Like for the second fantasy book I'm writing, there's a lot of historical research. So we're probably going to do an episode on that to talk about like the process and bring in the fact my friend has a history degree, although she's in a bit of denial about that because she never uses it. So yeah, it is kind of a bit like yours in that it's tied into what we want to know, but also things we wish we'd known. Yeah. Like some of the mistakes and things, like when people react to reviews, for example, that's one thing we always try and say don't do, and don't let it really haunt you, because they can. But you need that kind of warning up front, because otherwise it is hard to let it go and not prepare yourself.
Yeah. Just the episode that just came out this week. So we're recording this on July 14th, and it was how to receive and give critique with Tiffany Yates Martin, because that is a tough one.
So hard.
Both in kind of critique group kind of scenarios, and also we talked about do you read your reader reviews or not?
That is hard. Do you read yours?
I do, and I have been lucky that I haven't gotten any. I mean, I don't read them exhaustively, so who knows what's out there. And I always read the good ones. Like sometimes you just need a little pick me up and you go out there and you say, just show me the 5 stars. And you can read through those and, it gives you a little boost of energy. But I do read I skim my reviews, I'd say. And it was interesting that one benefit I got out of that was that when my first book, The Sense of Death, came out, I was getting, fortunately very good reviews. But when people marked it down, it was usually because of the profanity. And it's not that profane. But I thought, wow, that seems unfair. I'm going to go count how many F-bombs there are. And I thought, there can't be more than I don't know, half a dozen. So I counted and there were 19. I was like, okay, because one of the characters is like a guy who drops the F-bomb a lot. But I kind of sensed that it was interfering with the enjoyment of what I understood to be my emerging demographic of readers. And so I went through and I assessed each instance of that word. And I thought, in some of these cases, I think I could pull it back. And I think, the story won't lose anything by it. There's some where I'm like, nope, that's what he would say. And so I went from 17 to 9 or something like that. But I thought it was a good market research effort to see those reviews. And then, of course, the benefit of the Indy author is that afternoon, I could have the updated copy out that only had 9 F-bombs. And that would never happen in a traditional publishing scenario.
Yeah, they definitely wouldn't move that fast, would they?
No, I don't think they'd ever reissue the interior of a book just because people were unhappy with the amount of profanity.
No, probably not. I think they might consider it for the second edition, but that would be years down the line if they do a second edition, and that depends on if the book is popular enough in the first place.
Right.
So going back to podcasting, what types of writer do you think could benefit the most from podcasting?
I think that any type of writer could, as long as their expectations are aligned with the effort they're willing to put into it. So if your goal is that you want an excuse to be able to talk with other people in the writing and publishing world and make it attractive to them by sharing that out in a podcast scenario, then great. You could be very, very likely be successful with that goal in mind with a very basic podcast without doing any marketing. If your goal is to make money, then you need to make sure that the actions that you're taking are aligned with the goal of making money. And you have to maybe up the professionalism level. You have to put in more marketing effort. And so I don't think it's good for some writers and not good for some writers. It's just a matter of the alignment. I think you need to do your homework to understand what that is. And I also think you have to understand what kind of interaction you want to have with people. Sometimes I hear people say that they want to do a podcast because they have a lot of information to share with people. And that's great if you're doing a solo podcast. But if you want to have guests, then you better be a person who also enjoys listening to people. And so also aligning it not only with your business goals and creative goals, but your personal strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, I think it can work for anybody depending on what the goal is and what you can bring to it.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, I think. What about you then? What has podcasting taught you about yourself or your writing?
Well, one of the things it's taught me is that I never really want to do a live event. I love doing recorded things because, if things go really off the rails, then it's not as tragic. But yeah, I think it's taught me about myself that I think I am a good listener on my own podcast, but that as I'm demonstrating here in my answer to you, I'm less good on the instant response. And so that's another reason I like the recording, because if I have to go, for a few seconds, I can do that. And then on the writing front, I would say that what it has taught me about my writing is that other very successful and popular people who write in the crime fiction genre, as I do, bring really, really different approaches to it than I do. So I would say when I first wrote my first book, I was sort of between a plotter and a pantser. And I wrote that first book by having one chapter very clearly in mind, a chapter that was maybe a third of the way through the book. And I wrote it, polished it. And then I had to write the whole book leading up to that scene and the whole story leading away from it, which was a very, very inefficient way of writing a book. It took me 2.5 years to write that book. And once I left my day job, I knew that 2.5 years between books is not really going to be sustainable. And so I've become more and more of a plotter and really trying to pin down a story in a spreadsheet before I dive too deep on the details. I mean, I don't do that as strictly as I'm making it sound, but the more I can move to that end of the spectrum, then the more quickly I can write high quality books. But just crime fiction writer after crime fiction writer came on the podcast and they were like, I'm always interested to see where the story will take me. And I'm like, seriously? You're writing like a mystery and you don't know how it ends? And so I think I learned from that, not that I have to be more of a pantser, but that there are really different approaches that people can take that will end with a high quality, successful, and potentially popular book. And that you should listen to those different approaches and think about them, but you shouldn't necessarily run after them if they seem, again, incompatible with your style. It's aligning how you're approaching it with what your strengths are and what your goals are.
Yeah, it can be really hard sometimes, I think. And one of the most intimidating things I found was trying to come up with a plotting system that worked, because I didn't have anything for my first book. And I got about halfway through it and started to get a bit lost. And I'm like, well, this is going to get worse when there are 5 books in this series. And then there's a spin-off series and another spin-off series and another spin-off. I'm like, I kind of need to write all this down. So I created a spreadsheet of like everything from birthdays to when I kill off characters to when people meet and stuff, just so that I got that consistency. And how many books into the series am I now? I'm about 10 books into the universe and I'm still referring back to that spreadsheet.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I found the way it plays out for me is my books are very much dependent on who knows what when. And so if I don't think through, I've had the situation where I've almost gone down a path writing as if a character knows something that if I step back and look at it, I realize they either don't know or they shouldn't know, and that it's better that they don't know or shouldn't know. And that's so much easier to do if you're playing with like a 10,000 word outline, I'll say, because, my outline isn't just bullet points. It's quite beefy. And that really paid off for me in The Falcon and the Owl, which is the 4th book, because my 3rd Ann Kinnear book, because I wrote up this beefy outline. I sent it to my editor and I said, can you just take a look at this before I start writing? And he got back to me and he said, well, I think you really have to make the bad guy badder, because at the end, I'm not really buying it. And I thought about that for a while and I talked to him and I said, I ended up saying, I don't think that person's badder. I think I picked the wrong bad guy. I think I have to rework it to make somebody else be the bad guy. And that was a lot easier to do with 10,000 words on the page than it would have been with 80,000 words on the page. So
yeah, definitely.
This I'm curious to see where this is going to go just freaks me out.
Yeah, I don't outline and the thought just makes me want to have a panic attack. But I do write quite extensive notes. I bullet point everything and I make sure I know how things happen. That's the really important thing for me, is I can write down what happens, but if I don't know how something happens, that's when I'm likely to get stuck. And nearly every scene that I've got stuck on, the last I don't even know how many times, it's been because I didn't know how to execute something. So I'd usually end up skipping that scene and writing the next one and trying to figure it out retrospectively.
Yeah. And I think the other really important thing, if you're doing something like fantasy or sci-fi, is writing out the how it happens in a very literal way. This was possible because there's no gravity on this planet. Well, there better never be gravity on that planet then, because if you don't maintain the consistency of your story, then you're going to lose the readers.
That was something my editor really pushed me on when I was writing my first fantasy book. She was like, how does this work? How does that work? I'm like, I hate you. And then I'm like, actually, I know you're right. And I still hate you, but I love you. And it's like, but it was one of those things, because she writes fantasy as well. And she was saying, like, if you know these things now, it saves you time and energy in the future having to figure them out or shooting yourself in the foot because you're being inconsistent. And even though a lot of the things I worked out, I'm not going to need until book 4, 5, 6, etc., because I know it now, I can foreshadow things or make sure there aren't inconsistencies.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. More power to you that you're having like a vision across multiple books, because that is something that with the Ann Kinnear books, it really doesn't matter. There's sort of an arc for Anne, but it's, the arc is the arc is more of an upward trajectory of her feeling more comfortable with her special ability, which is that she can communicate with dead people. But each book is pretty much self-contained. But when I wrote the first Lizzie Ballard book, I didn't know that it was going to be more than just one. And then I got to the end of that and I was like, well, clearly there's more story here. I wrote a second one and then I wrote the third one, but I didn't have an idea of that 3-story arc when I started. And that made it so much harder. I mean, I'm pleased now with how that came out, but it was a lot more work than if I'd gone into it saying, okay, it's going to be 3 stories and it's going to be divided this way.
Yeah, that's why I did the plan, because my first series, I always knew it'd be 4 or 5 books. And then my second series was meant to be 1 and that turned into 6. But I always kind of know where I want the characters to start and end up, either in that book or in that series. Yeah. And with Afterlife Calls, I always knew the kind of first arc of that would be 4 books, because I've got a very clear endpoint for where the 2 characters need to be for each one. And then beyond that, I'm like, okay, what ghostly tropes can I play with and have fun with? Because there is an element of comedy in this series as well. And it gets quite dark in book 4. So I'm like, how can I lighten it up after that? And I find that if I plan in advance, then I can figure out those plot holes before I start writing. And also quite often I'm planning 2 or 3 books ahead in a series compared to what I'm writing. So then I can think about what I want to foreshadow and what needs changing in the plan based on how the book I'm writing has gone.
Yeah, that's very impressive.
It gets stuff out of my head. That's why I plan everything so far ahead, because otherwise my head is just full of stories and things to do with my characters. I don't have the headspace to sit and write. And that's why I quite like writing either in the morning or at night, because my brain is already switched off and it's not thinking about other things. So my characters get my attention and I'm not worrying about it. All the creative stuff, all the problem solving has already been done in the planning process. So then I'm just getting the words out onto the page. And the worst part is if my hands hurt from typing too fast.
That's a good problem to have. That's very interesting. Yeah, I like that idea of, like, that's another one of those things that everybody says, get up first thing in the morning and write. I'm like, well, yeah, give it a try. But if it doesn't work for you, don't keep hammering away at it.
Yeah, I did try that, actually, writing my third Afterlife Calls book. And I finished a draft of it a couple of days ago. And then do you ever just feel really drained after writing something? Because that was me. I was a zombie for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, because I wrote 3 really heavy scenes in 2 days from like 2 different books. And I was like, I really don't think I can keep doing this morning routine right now. I need a break from writing because I'm emotionally exhausted.
Yeah, and I think there are considerations too, like if I don't get all my admin stuff out of the way first, then it's kind of hanging over my head. And if I can bang that out, then I can switch my attention to fiction with less distraction.
Yeah, I'm the opposite. If I don't like mornings at all, but I like writing in the morning because my brain isn't awake enough to do the admin stuff. So it can only focus on the writing or like playing with the dog because it requires as little effort and energy as possible. And then by the time I finish my writing session, I'm like, okay, I really need breakfast now, or I'm raring to go and I need to do some exercise or something. And it just it does inspire me for the day and give me a sense of accomplishment. Although I should say I haven't done any writing in the mornings for the last couple of days. And I feel like I've been less productive in those days, not just in terms of writing, but in terms of everything that I do. I've had less motivation.
Very interesting. Yeah, everybody's wired a little differently for that.
Yeah. Considering I absolutely detest mornings, but I was enjoying my morning writing. And I think I know what book I'm going to draft next now as well, after my little break. And it's something with a happier ending. So that probably helps.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. You were saying earlier about how your books had a humorous twist, but it was sort of a darker humor. And it's interesting for you to think through even like the arc of the kind of humor, because that's something, again, that's kind of a convenience of reading reader reviews, that sometimes I'll read one and people emphasize the humorous aspects. Like one of my books, The Falcon and the Owl, does have a more humorous subplot of this group of people who've gotten together and they're trying to make it a documentary, but it goes downhill right away. And so it's just all infighting and sniping at each other. And I thought it was funny, but it was good to read reviews and see that other people thought it was funny also.
Yeah, it's reassuring, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a seance scene in The Ghost Crawl, and it was a last minute addition before I sent it to beta readers. And nearly everyone commented on the same things, like, oh my God, I love Javi. I need more of him in the book, because he haunts his ex-wife, basically. And I'm like, wow, he's decided he's going to be in this series for the foreseeable future, even though he was meant to be in like 2 scenes. So you've got your wish.
Yep. Exactly.
I just can't get rid of him.
It is great market research if you can ignore, any nastiness that leaks into the reader reviews.
Yeah. I do know someone who reads her negative reviews as kind of a way to find feedback and ways to improve her writing. But obviously you have to filter out the people projecting or who just don't like swear words or the kind of silly things people comment on that aren't really of any substance that you inevitably get.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I've been running Facebook ads, and I do try to interact with all the people who comment on the Facebook ads. And most of them, fortunately, have been very positive. And that's been nice because then I invite those people to my author page. And once they're on the author page, I invite them to a private Facebook group. And so I feel like I have this nice funnel into really being able to interact quite directly with readers. One of them, so I was using an author blurb in the ad, and someone took exception to the way the author had provided the blurb had used this one word. She thought it should be a different word. She thought she had used it inappropriately, that the person who wrote the blurb didn't understand what the word meant. So I looked up both the word that the author had used and the word that this person said it should be. And I was like, you know what? They're both fine. They mean slightly different things. But it was all I could do not to go on there and post like, here's the Merriam-Webster definition of what that word means. So you explain to me why it doesn't make sense. But so far, I've avoided doing that.
So far. The temptation is strong, though.
It's fading over time. So I think if I've gotten this far, I'll be able to continue to resist.
Yeah, the longer you avoid it, the easier it becomes.
Exactly.
Talking about your writing then and podcasting, how have you found podcasting has affected your writing?
Well, I think that in some cases, and maybe this is just a self-fulfilling prophecy, it has enabled me to tweak how I approach my writing. I mean, certainly, I had mentioned that episode I did with Stephen James, and I think the name of that episode was 12 Things You Can Do to Kill the Suspense in Your Novel. So that's just straight out educational. You just read that and you say, okay, I have to make sure I'm not doing these 12 things. It was he had a really fun way of going about it. So certainly, I feel like I'm gleaning craft tips every time I talk to somebody about craft. And from the writing process point of view, I think in many cases, it's made me feel comfortable with the process I have. One of my favorite episodes was episode 30, Common Writer Wisdom, Is It Right for You with Becca Syme. I loved her approach, which is that it's not one size fits all. And there are all these things people say, like write first thing in the morning, or make sure you get 100 words or whatever, that work fine for some people. Like there are tropes you hear because they've worked for some amount of people, but that you have to think about whether they're right for you. And one of the things that I felt more comfortable about my writing process after having talked with Becca on the podcast is that I'm not even a writing fiction every day kind of person, but I realize that I'm always writing in my head. And so I'll take the dog for a walk. I'll be driving somewhere on errands. I'll be folding laundry. And I'm really writing because I'm composing. And then when I sit down, it's kind of like, bleh, and I'm not saying it's clean, but it's, I'll go for 3 days without writing anything, and then I'll write 4,000 words because it's all been percolating, And so some of it is just relieving me of that angst of maybe I'm doing it wrong. And so that's been nice. But also then picking out those things where, well, is this something I really should look at? Because maybe I am sub-optimizing, like this idea that maybe I do need to move toward the plotter, continuing pushing myself toward the plotter side.
I've spoken to about 3 people now who've mentioned outlining, and I'm like, is this something I should be doing? And then my brain goes, no, you do not need that much depth. You would die of boredom if you fleshed it out in that much depth.
Exactly.
It does not fit your writing style. As long as you know the key scenes and how stuff happens, you're fine. But then further down the line, I might change my mind. I'm open to the concept, but right now it's not for me. And you've just got to maintain that open mind that there are different ways of doing things, and you might find that what works now isn't going to work in the future. But if you've studied those other ways of doing it, then you can always adapt because you've already got those tools.
Yeah.
Talking about you then, what one book have you read that's changed your life?
That is such a tough question. And I think I would say The Sword and the Stone. So The Sword and the Stone was my first favorite book. And my parents read it to me when I was little. And then when I got older, I read it myself. And it wasn't like, I was 6 and read it and said, oh, my life is different. But I think that it's such a great book. It's such a classic. And in retrospect, of course, these weren't lessons that I took from it until much later, but I think it paved the way for understanding that writing in a way that's accessible to children, it does not preclude writing in a way that's entertaining and engaging for adults. That even taking a story that's been done before, it's King Arthur, for heaven's sake, can be done in a new and fresh and engaging way. The fact that you can drop in, these just tear-jerking kind of moments with, laugh out loud funny moments in one story. The idea that you can have characters who are not strictly good or bad. I think of Kay, Arthur's adoptive brother, and kind of what a jerk he is. And yet you understand why Arthur, as the protagonist, loves him. I just think it was a great early example of a wonderfully written book that I loved. And then as I grew older and studied craft more, I kind of understood more why I loved it that much.
I really like that. I've certainly found going back through stuff I used to enjoy when I was younger, I now understand why I enjoyed it as well. And I can spot where it influenced me as well, which then just makes me a little bit embarrassed how much some things influenced me. So where can our listeners go to find out more about you?
They can go to mattydalrymple.com if they're interested in my fiction work. So that's Matty with a Y, Matty, mattydalrymple.com. And if they're interested in the nonfiction, it's at the indyauthor.com, and it's Indy with a Y, INDY. And I would love it if they would check out the Indy Author podcast.
It's a really great podcast. I was listening to it the other day when I was driving up to meet Ellie, and it was the episode you did with Jenna Marusi, talking about, I think it's writing villains or something.
Yes.
This is really interesting. Oh, can I use this? Must pay attention to the sat nav.
That was a super fun one. She was super fun to talk to.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really great chat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Take care. Did you find this episode enlightening? Don't forget to hit that shiny, shiny subscribe button so that you never miss an episode.
Or if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and hit the like button. It helps other writers to find us, and it lets us know what type of content you want more of.
And don't forget, you can support The Writer's Mindset over on Patreon for as little as your favorite coffee a month.
Join our growing gang of writers and get early access to episodes, bonus content, and writing workshops.
Visit patreon.com/writersmindset to find out more.
See you next time.
Keep writing.